Thanksgiving. Turkey steaming, phones buzzing. My son slides a manila envelope and says, "Painless, Dad, sign before dessert." 40 winners building this house becomes outdated paperwork in his ridiculous script. A pre-filled POA, staged verification calls, and a scheme to reopen my trust while I pour coffee. He calls it protection. I call it theft. I turn the speaker on, counsel ready, Article 9 loaded, and make a cold vow. No authorization. Not tonight. Not ever. When family weaponizes love, do you surrender or reclaim your name? My name is Thomas Hale, 72, United States Army Corps of Engineers, Staff Sergeant once, builder always, survivor of long sand and short nights. I ran roads in Desert Storm, stacked barriers after floods, and learned to make order with a tape, a pencil, and stubborn will. Commendations rest in a cedar box, meritorious service, Army commendation, a campaign ribbon that still smells like diesel. I swing a hammer cleaner than I swing a speech. I read plans, wire panels, pour slabs level to the bubble, track costs the way a medic tracks pulse. I went home, married Linda, raised one son, Daniel, and kept working through winters, splitting knuckles on studs and concrete. Loss taught discipline. A crushed knee on a job, a brother gone to a wreck, a platoon friend who never found his way back. I paid off the house board by board, paycheck by paycheck. Then I kept saving, because saving is a sandbag line against foolish weather. My habits are simple: coffee black, lists in ink, locks checked twice. My trait that matters most is this: I do not confuse love with blind trust, and I do not surrender ground I can ever fortify. Linda likes order, church at 9, roast at 5, and a clean calendar tacked to the fridge with a magnet. Daniel came headstrong and quick with numbers, stacked baseball cards by team, and learned to argue like he was pitching a bid. I taught him to hold a level and read the bubble, and he taught me to send texts without stabbing the screen. When he started college, I took a night shift, re-roofing an old mill, and tucked the extra pay into his tuition like a note under a plate, because that is what fathers do when the beam needs bracing. Our grandson Nate arrived later, calm eyes, sweeter than the others at that age, and he watched my hands whenever I fixed anything, asking why a screw bites or a hinge squeaks. Family dinners kept the week stitched together. If Linda set the table, I set the tone, and we took turns reminding each other that kindness is a job you clock into. Money stayed quiet except when a crisis flared, a car died, a job slipped away, or a dream needed a bridge loan. I bridged. The first big one came when Daniel lost his contract and showed up with a manila folder and a red-rimmed explanation about payroll lag. I wrote a check, skipped adding a handrail that month, ate plain eggs, and told him, "Pay me back when the footing is sure." He nodded, hugged me too hard, and left that folder on my counter. Years stacked, and so did favors. Linda's dental work, a down payment that made sense at the time, a small business account I co-signed. I was the steady hand. The house became a hub, forms on the dining table, batteries charging in the kitchen for whatever was next. I told myself, this is support, not surrender, because love is a build, and builds need material. When friends asked if Daniel was doing well, I said he was finding his season. And maybe I believed it, because his good weeks had a shine that made it easy to forget the dents. Linda said, "Let him try new tools." I said, "Sure, but keep the manual." We built a routine where I hauled the heavy loads and they kept my calendar full, and for a long time that felt like balance, until balance started leaning, and I noticed which side took the weight, and the fridge calendar began filling with their plans instead of mine. The jokes turned into reminders, and the reminders into requests that never paused for my breath, not once. I keep a ledger because numbers don't lie when people do. So here is the total that pushed me to the edge. Over 40 years, I saved $620,000, paid off a house appraised at $384, kept tools worth $15, and a pension that lands on the first like a train. In 7 years, outflow to family under help reads $148,919. 42 for Daniel's down payment, 26 for his second pivot, 13 to cover payroll during a 2-week lag that stretched into fall, 9 for a truck to court clients, 8 for Linda's bridge work, and the rest in quiet transfers and card payoffs. My pension covers my bills with a little for lumber. Their appetites assumed I printed money in the crawl space. They started saying, "Consolidate your accounts and streamline authorization and let us simplify, Dad, so you don't chase signatures." Painless showed up so often I wrote the translation on a sticky note. Control. 3 months ago, Daniel slid a pre-filled power of attorney across my table, blue pen uncapped, and said, "This is just so banks stop putting you on hold." I capped the pen and said, "I'm not on hold, I'm on guard." Unknown number calls began like scheduled rain. A flat voice would verify my address because an update request had been received to change beneficiaries or retitle an account under the Hale Family Trust. I said, "Send it by certified mail." The line would click to static, and goodbye. At Sunday dinner, Daniel said, "The banks will keep calling until we clean this up. Just sign tonight." Linda rubbed my arm and said, "You taught him duty." That word turned like a nail. I matched dates. Verification calls landed on my VA appointment days as if someone set timers on my absences. Twice I heard a recorder app click when the talk turned to accounts. Once, Daniel joked at coffee hour about old man paperwork and watched the laugh like he wanted a receipt. The insults went public, in small ways. Dad's stuck in the 70s. Dad loves lists more than people. Dad will lose everything to probate if we don't rescue him. I pulled receipts. The down payment never became equity. Refinances chased upgrades until the house owned him. The truck hauled more beer than blueprints. The payroll emergency lined up with a getaway post. Hustle recharge. 2 words that don't make a ledger whole. I drew a simple chart. Green for income, red for help withdrawals, yellow for promises. Yellow filled the page. Always that refrain. Consolidate and painless. As if repetition could hypnotize a stubborn man into handing over the perimeter keys. Linda began setting appointments without telling me. He'd say, "You taught me to work smart," I'd say, "and to keep hands off what isn't yours." The last week of October, a certified letter arrived addressed to me and to a trust name I had never signed, requesting a phone authorization between 5 and 7 the night of family supper. It mentioned a clause for reopening and funding on confirmation. Reopen means it once existed. I finally saw the outline drawn in corporate font. Unbelievable in audacity, familiar in tone, painless efficiency. Just say yes, let us help. He loved a ritual. The manila envelope, the blue pen, the smile that said painless. He'd tap the envelope like a gavel and say, "Sign before dessert, celebrate after." I'd slide the envelope under salt and keep eating. Last week, the night before Thanksgiving, the house smelled like rosemary and heat, while I checked the oven's seal the way I check doors before sleep. Nate tugged my sleeve and whispered, "Grandpa, Dad left a paper in your coat." "What paper?" I asked, and he said, "The kind he keeps asking you to sign." I pulled my field jacket from the hook, reached inside, and found a draft that wasn't a mistake. A neatly prepared directive to reopen and fund the Hale Family Trust, complete with a phone script and a list of institutions to call during the window. The language matched the certified letter. Article 9 sat bold, authorizing transfers upon verification by a designated agent. In their plan, agent meant Daniel, with my voice taped to his phone, a new variable. I set the draft on the table and squared the corners. Linda came in with silverware, stopped and said, "Daniel asked me to bring that to the bank if you forgot." Courier, not partner. I kept my face steady. "We'll eat, and we'll talk after dessert," I said. My mind flipped into mission mode and stayed there. The window read 5 to 7. Family supper would cover 5 to 7, hands busy, voices soft. The perfect time to push a signature and call it care. 7 years ago, I would have argued and lost ground. This time, I opened the study drawer, pulled the cedar box, and checked the notarized affidavit I had prepared the week before. Some part of me had already felt the wind shift. The affidavit named me competent, confirmed funding of a trust under my terms, and barred outside authorizations without my direct voice to counsel. I walked to the shop, unlocked the bolted box, and reviewed the executed trust and the list of accounts with transfer restrictions fully placed 2 days earlier, time-stamped 1657. Check the stamp, then breathe. I called my lawyer and said, "Stand by tomorrow at 6:15. He said, "I'll keep the line open." Daniel arrived early, casserole in one hand, smile in the other, phone face down by his plate. "Painless tonight, Dad. Just a couple signatures so you can relax," he said. Linda's eyes flicked to the jacket hook. I asked Nate to say grace. During the meal, unknown number calls vibrated the table like a cricket under a cup. Daniel ignored them with aggressive politeness, and I let the sound paint the room. At dessert, he slid the manila envelope out, tapped it like a gavel, and said, "We do this now, then we celebrate." I said, "I'll read a line first." He said, "Dad, we practice this." "That's the problem," I said. His hand hovered over the phone, and I saw the path forward as clean as a chalk line. Frailty is a coat. I put it on. I softened my shoulders, nodded small, and said, "Help me understand Article 9. He smiled like a man stepping onto a stage. My decision set not in ink but in concrete. I had already poured. Another buzz rattled the table, and the vibration timed itself to the clock edging towards 6. I let it run, for once quietly. I stepped to the sink and washed my hands like a surgeon before the cut, because clean hands remind the mind to be precise. The house carried the soft noise of dishes, and under it a ticking. I rehearsed the sequence. Listen, let him show the angle, then flip the board and reveal the grain. I'd keep my voice level, keep my facts sharper than any accusation, and use the tools I trust. Notaries, receipts, and timestamps older than tonight's pitch. Article 9 would be read by the person who wrote my Article 9, not by a son who auditioned for my voice. The shop was locked, the trust funded, the holds in place, witnesses ready. Daniel cleared his throat and reached for the phone. Linda lifted her glass. Nate watched my hands. I relaxed the coat of frailty and kept the script I never said out loud. Quiet preparation defeats performative authority. The line would be mine, not theirs, when truth met paper tonight. Then, the phone buzzed again, and I said, "Let's take this call." New woke up the next morning before the streetlights gave up, brewed black coffee without sugar, and laid my tape measure on the counter like a rifle I did not need to fire, because my war now was paper and time. The old discipline slid back into my bones, steady and familiar, and I felt the mission click into place like a safety catching, because I will not be ambushed in my own house again. I wrote the objective in block letters on a yellow pad. Protect command. Preserve assets. Prove coercion. Then I drew lines under each word the way I draw chalk lines across fresh slab, and I promised myself I would not argue or plead. I would document and act. A new variable sat on the table in a manila skin, and I treated it like ordnance. Careful hands, clear mind, no unnecessary drama. Linda came in, looked at the pad and said, "This is insane, Thomas. We are a family." And I said, "We are. And families do not sneak scripts into jackets." She reached for the envelope, and I moved it half an inch left, because distance matters when lines are getting drawn. I kept my voice plain and dry, and I told her the new rule. No signatures without counsel on the line. No phone confirmations without a recording. No more painless talk in my kitchen. She stared, then turned to the sink, then back to me, and I watched the denial run like cold water over a dirty plate. Because I have seen this wash before. The warrior woke quietly, and he made a list. I started with records because records do not blink. I pulled bank statements for 2 years, printed call logs from my phone carrier, and requested IP login history on every account that touched $1 I earned. Then, I laid each sheet on the dining table and squared the corners like I was lining tile. I made a timeline with a red pencil for every unknown call, a green pencil for every visit to the VA, and a blue pencil for each Manila conversation. And the colors formed a pattern so obvious, it made me smile without joy. The calls clustered on my VA days. The folders appeared the night before those days, and the certified letters scheduled their finish under our Thanksgiving toasts. So, they thought the ritual would hide the crime. I opened the coat pocket draft and read each line like a bomb tech reading a pressure plate diagram. Then I found the fingerprints buried in the font, the outside advisor's name in the footer, and a boutique law group watermark, faint as a whisper. I copied both into my notes and pulled the county business registry to see who paid who, and a small LLC with a PO box tied to a notary we had used once glared back at me like a nail up through carpet. I checked my house cameras, which I had installed to watch the driveway and never needed for the kitchen, and I widened the angle just enough to see the dining table spine to spine because this time I wanted a clean record of who placed what where. I called my credit union and asked for a supervisor, then said plainly, I require a no-transfer hold on all accounts pending in-person confirmation with counsel. And the woman on the line said, yes, sir, we can flag it, and she read back the timestamp while I wrote it twice. I scanned every document I cared about into an encrypted USB drive, labeled it with a piece of blue painter's tape, slid it into the cedar box with my service bars, and carried the box to the safe I bolted into the shop slab years ago in case of wildfire. I drove to the bank where the manager still calls me Mr. Hale because I fixed his port for parts and pie when he was broke, and I opened a small safe deposit box for the medals and a certified copy of the trust because symbols sometimes need cover too. He asked if everything was all right, and I said, I am securing what I earned. And his face agreed without words. On the way home, I stopped by the county clerk and filed the affidavit of competency I had prepared with my lawyer last week, watched the seal press the paper like a boot, and recorded the instrument number in my pad with a little box next to it. I checked the pawn shops for the notary's name, because people who cut corners often leave scrap where they drink coffee, and the third shopkeeper said, that lady notarizes everything under the sun. And I wrote down the joke and moved on, because humor keeps blood pressure within range when the stakes turn ridiculous. Back home, I opened a fresh page and drew a network map. Daniel, Linda, outside advisor, boutique firm, notary, bank agents, credit union, VA scheduler, grandson Nate. I circled Nate and wrote trust anchor, because he told the truth without fishing for applause. Then I circled Daniel and wrote objective, control, method, proximity, cover story, taxes, probate, painless. With the map visible, I ran a vulnerability scan the way I would check a building before winter. No panic, no skipping. Financially, my exposure lived in any account with the phone authorization path, any beneficiary form older than a decade, and any joint instrument that had become habit instead of necessity. So I listed each and marked action against it. Hold placed, beneficiary verified, autopay rerouted, check back scheduled. I caught a soft spot in an old brokerage with a mailing address from before the remodel, and I drove down there with a folder under my arm and a hard face. Then I sat with a patient clerk and insisted every setting be set to face-to-face authentication or counsel's number only, because convenience is a thief with a smile. Reputationally, I understood they were already painting me as stubborn and out of step, so I kept my tone steady with every officer and clerk, and I wrote a memo to myself, no raised voices, only receipts. Legally, my strength was my preparation and my mind, so I doubled down on both. Doctor check last week, clean. Affidavit filed this week, clean. Witnesses identified and briefed. Counsel on standby, with his own copies. Emotionally, my weak flank was Linda, because love makes us slow when we need speed. So I reduced her role to hospitality and told her gently that any courier work ends now. She bristled and said, if you loved me, you would make this simple. And I said, I do love you, and simplicity is sometimes a lock, not a shortcut. A new variable, the boutique firm. I ran their roster, pulled their office suite from public listings, and noted they had a habit of filing elder-friendly templates with soft edges. So I wrote in my pad, tactic, weaponize kindness, and under it, counter, weaponize clarity. I phoned my VA benefits officer and asked if anyone had requested verification recently, and he said, "We got a third-party inquiry last week, but we shut it down." And I marked the date against my timeline, and the red and green marks hugged each other like exposed wire. I tested my own defenses by calling my bank from a blocked number and asking a dumb question. And when the agent said, "We cannot discuss anything without in-person ID or counsel," I smiled, because the hold worked. Then I called the boutique firm and asked for a copy of any drafts with my name they believed existed. And the receptionist said, "We do not send drafts to third parties." And I said, "I am not third, I am first." And the line went quiet long enough for me to hear her decide whether to escalate. Then she said, "Someone will call you back." And I wrote, "callback trap" next to her number. Mistake. Noted. If they called Daniel first, I wanted the timestamp to tell the story better than my temper ever could. I set the plan in 4 clear objectives I could count with 2 hands and no confusion. First, stabilize the perimeter, which meant transfer restrictions, face-to-face requirements, safe deposit for symbols, and a clear written record of competency. Second, collect proof without announcing the raid, which meant camera angle adjusted, call logs printed, footers traced, and small tests placed like tripwires. Third, bring allies into position but keep their role surgical, which meant counsel on live standby with the affidavit and the funded trust, a bank manager ready to confirm holds if pressed, and Nate briefed only to tell the truth if someone asked him what he saw. Fourth, lock timing to their timing, because a good defense also controls the clock. So I scheduled my moves to fall just ahead of their window, with a clean line to Thanksgiving, so the scene plays at a table they thought they owned. I gave myself a timeline with hour marks: Wednesday morning filings done, Wednesday afternoon holds verified, Thursday noon kitchen prep with cameras live, 5 o'clock window opens and calls start, 6:15 counsel reads Article 9 from my trust, not yours, 6:30 backup confirmation from bank and credit union, 7 o'clock dessert, and a very quiet room. Contingencies sat under each step like shims under a beam. If counsel gets delayed, I read the clause myself and patch him in. If a call gets spoofed, I do not answer and I let voicemail capture. If Linda tries to carry a folder out of the house, I intercept with a gentle hand and a firmer boundary. If Daniel escalates into public theater, I keep voice low and let the paperwork be the only shouting. Success metrics were simple. No unauthorized transfer leaves my name, no signature hits paper without my consent, no story runs ahead of my facts. I added a line at the bottom and underlined it twice. No revenge tonight, only recovery and proof. I closed a pad and stowed it under the cedar box for half a second like a prayer. Then I put both back where they belong, in the safe. Because order is a weapon when chaos tries to drive. Night fell early because November likes to hide the sun, and I walked the perimeter once more. Window latches checked, shop deadbolt tested, front door reinforced with the extra plate I had installed after a scare long ago, and I stood in the driveway breathing air that smelled like leaves and something about to break. The phone buzzed with a private number, and I let it ring out. Then another with a different last digit, and I let it ring too, and voicemail caught a crisp female voice asking me to verify my address for an update, and I forwarded it to counsel with a 2-word note, same pattern. He replied with a thumbs up and a simple text, 6:15 tomorrow, I will read the clause that stands. I polished the metals in the quiet of the workshop until they flashed the shop light like a signal mirror, because calm hands keep the mind from doing something rash when insult burns too hot. Linda stood in the doorway and asked, "Are you really going to make this spectacle at dinner?" And I said, "I am going to make this safe, and safety sometimes looks like spectacle to people who live inside shortcuts." She said, "You are pushing Daniel away." And I said, "No, he is pushing himself off the ledger onto me." She shook her head and left, and I did not chase because chasing has cost me too much ground already. I checked the clock and set 2 alarms, one for the oven, one for the call, because mixing domestic and tactical requires clean timing or you scorch both turkey and truth. I slept light and woke to a dawn that felt like the morning of a controlled demolition, not because I wanted a collapse, but because a dangerous structure was finally getting braced. The first unknown number hit at 8:03 a.m., which told me someone was nervous and running a test call, and I let it go. And the second at 11:47 a.m., which told me someone had a checklist and a lunch break, and I let that go too. At 4:12 p.m., the boutique firm's main line lit my screen, and I answered because I wanted the tape, and a smooth voice said, "Mr. Hale, we want to make this painless." And I said, "Read me the authority by which you are calling." Then silence stretched long enough to prove there was none, and she hung up. I saved the audio file to the folder named for today, and I felt the last piece slide into place. By 5 o'clock, my table looked like every other year, if you squinted, but the quiet grids were under it. The holds, the affidavit, the cameras, the allies, and the resolve that does not break under a son's fake urgency. I placed the blue pen on the mantel because it would not touch their lines, and I folded the manila draft back into my coat pocket because bait sometimes belongs where thieves expect it. The oven timer chimed, the doorbell rang, and the first call of the window buzzed the table in the same breath. I poured water into glasses and told myself one more time, speak only when the document speaks first, and keep the tone steady, because this is not a brawl. This is a build. The vibration hummed under my palm like a live wire, and Daniel's eyes flicked to the phone with that same old hunger dressed up as duty, and I met his gaze and said, "We'll make it painless, all right?" Then I walked to the study where my lawyer waited on speaker, and I pressed connect, because it was time to deploy the quiet that breaks loud fraud. I hit connect and set the phone face down on the hall table with speaker on. Then I walked back into the dining room and sat where my reach touched both the manila envelope and the blue pen that would not move, because I wanted the rhythm clear. My move, their reaction, the next move, and a clean record under it all. Counsel's voice came in steady. "Mr. Hale, I'm here." And Daniel flashed that quick sales smile like a flare and said, "Perfect. We're just cleaning up a few signatures so Dad doesn't get stuck on hold anymore," while his thumb hovered above his own screen like a trigger waiting to brag. I said, "Before dessert, we read." And I slid the envelope halfway back to him, then stopped it with one finger so the paper made a soft, ridiculous squeak that cut the room. Linda poured coffee and tried for normal, but her hand jittered against the sugar bowl, and the spoon tapped the ceramic like a clock with a headache. The first unknown number buzzed again, and I watched Daniel not watch it, which told me he was waiting for a very specific ring he thought belonged to him, and I let that detail file itself, under pattern confirmed. Counsel said, "I have the instrument numbers and funding receipts in front of me, and per your instructions I will read the relevant clause when you give the word." And I nodded like he could see me through the drywall, then looked at Nate, who put his elbows down and his eyes up, because he understood without me saying it that tonight hinges on quiet courage. "Painless," Daniel said, chuckling. "Dad, you'll love this. 5 minutes and we're done." And I answered, "I do not love shortcuts labeled as care." Then I reached for the cedar box key in my pocket just to feel its edges and remind myself the ground was already poured. Move, counter-move, never rush, and let them show the angle before you flip the board. That is how you win inside a house you build with your own hands. Phase 1 started with hard numbers and colder timestamps, because money respects math, and the first strike was proof of perimeter. "Read Article 9, I said, and counsel said, "Article 9, on restrictions and coercion safeguards, executed 11 days ago with the undersigned in person, notarized in office, witness present, seals verified, states that no transfer, beneficiary modification, or account reopening is lawful without the grantor's live consent or counsel's direct recorded confirmation. Further, that any attempt to pierce this perimeter triggers an internal audit and notice to institutions A through F. Funding confirmation numbers as follows." Then he read a string of digits that landed like rivets along a beam. Daniel laughed too loud and said, "This is cute, but we're talking about the original family trust." And I said, "We are talking about the only trust that exists." Then I pulled my own copy, set it on the table, and tapped the embossed seal so Nate could see the light catch. The phone buzzed with a number tagged as my credit union, and Linda said, "Answer, Thomas, so we can move on." And I said, "We will answer together," then hit speaker and said, "This is Thomas Hale, counsel is present, proceed." The agent said, "Mr. Hale, we have a request to reopen and transfer under the Hale Family Trust. Per our hold, we're calling to verify in person." And Daniel tried to interrupt with, "Yes, this is his son author," but I lifted my palm, kept my voice clean, and said, "No authorization from any party other than me or counsel is valid. Read back the hold note with timestamp." The agent did. "Hold placed, 1657, 2 days prior." And I said, "Confirm that any third-party attempts will be logged with IP and caller ID." And the agent said, "Confirmed." Then added, careful and slow, "We also have a notation that counsel will read a clause." And counsel leaned into the microphone and read the one sentence that matters. "No phone verification absent grantor's direct yes shall be treated as fraud attempt." Daniel's jaw set. Then he said, "Dad, this is ridiculous. The tax exposure is insane if we don't coordinate." And I said, "If tax was your mission, you'd bring a CPA and a calendar, not a pre-filled power and a script you slipped into my coat." The next move came fast. He thumbed a preset contact that turned out to be the boutique firm's on-call, and a smooth voice said, "Mr. To make this painless, we can walk through a consolidated transfer." And I answered, "List your authority first." Then I swiveled my phone so the camera inside the kitchen carried the call to the hard drive in my study, because documentation is oxygen when people play scripts. The voice offered a vague reference to a community template, and counsel said, "Name the executed instrument and date," and the voice fell silent, which is what happens when a bluff meets a ledger. I pressed the second part of the attack by calling the bank manager who knows my porch boards and said, "We're live on speaker. Confirm our no transfer hold and read the service record note." And he did. Holds across accounts, caller ID trap set. Any request that does not begin with code phrase steel blue is denied. And I said, "Steel blue." Because sometimes you plant a code just to make fraud sweat. And Daniel swallowed because he knows what sweat tastes like when a bid goes bad. While the room absorbed that, I slid the manila draft back and opened it to the footer. Then read the LLC and suite number out loud. And counsel said, "I see their filing history. None of it touches your name. We are done here." Which means checkmate on the first board, without raised voices, only receipts. Daniel shifted to the truck angle. "It's just a call to verify the beneficiary alignment." And I said, "Alignment would require me to be present, like a wheel that still belongs to the car. You tried to steer from outside." Then I nodded at the phone again like a conductor bringing in the low brass, because timing wins more fights than muscle. The credit union agent, still on the line, said, "We will record these attempts." And I said, "Thank you." Then ended the call with the calm a builder uses when he has found the stud, and the screw is already biting. That's financial war without spectacle. Holds confirmed, authority challenged, the trick exposed, and the window still open. Which meant I had to anticipate the revenge escape call they were surely prepping to shove through before dessert. Reputation is a slower river. So I stepped into it with clean boots and a camera pointed at the current, because if you let liars define the bank, they will flood you into looking like a fool. I said, "We'll have pie with friends dropping by." And Linda said, "Thomas, this is family." And I answered, "Family is safe or it's theater." Then the doorbell rang like I had cued it, and my neighbor who runs the VFW hall came in with his wife and a store-bought pecan satellite wrapped in plastic. And he said, "I heard there's coffee," and sat where he could see everything and pretend to talk about football. I did not need a crowd. I needed a witness who knew the difference between a story and a report. Daniel tried humor, which is a reputation trick. "Dad's doing a whole courthouse right at the table." And I countered with quiet gravity, "I am doing safety." Then I pulled out the call log printouts and set them next to the certified letter and the coat pocket draft, side by side, like 3 planks cut to length. And I said to my neighbor, "You spent more than a decade verifying other men's identities. You tell me if these align." And he put on his reading glasses and took his time. The boutique firm called back, and I answered on speaker with counsel still open. Then I asked, "Before you sell me painless, did you speak with my son before you called me back?" and the voice hesitated long enough for the truth to walk across the room and sit down. And she said, "We're just following up." And I said, "Following whom?" Then I let the pause stretch, because silence invites honesty when bluster fails. Nate cleared his throat and said softly, "Dad mailed Grandma a letter last week and told me not to show Grandpa." And Daniel snapped, "Stay out of this." And I said, "He is in this because truth makes you angry, not him." Then I turned to Linda and said, "Courier work ends tonight." And she looked like a woman who just realized the door she has been holding open is not for guests, but for thieves. And she set her glass down hard enough to draw a circle of coffee on the table that will probably stain just enough to remind us. I ran the reputation strike like I would a punch list, fast and precise. I texted the extended family a single-page memo I had prepared with counsel's help, subject line, confirming boundaries, no action required, that listed the holds, the affidavit, the trust executed, and a simple sentence, "No one is authorized to speak to banks for me," and then I set the phone down because the point is to inform, not to spar. The VFW friend nodded toward the paper and said in a normal voice, "Looks like you're squared away," which is reputation gold inside a small community that loves to gossip about wills as if they were ball games. Daniel tried the tax fear again. "If he dies without this consolidation, probate eats the house." And I said, "House is in trust, as of 11 days ago, recorded with instrument number 841-C. Check the county site if you don't trust me." And my neighbor took out his phone like a man who enjoys confirming a fact in real time, then said, "Yep." And the sound of his agreement cut through the ridiculous script like a saw finding the kerf. The boutique firm tried one more angle. "We can schedule a meeting to discuss elder-friendly optimization." And counsel said, "You will send any materials to me first. You have contacted a represented party." And the voice said, "Of course," which translates to, "We got burned in front of witnesses, and we will now retreat into email where we can delete our mistakes." I did not shout about betrayal. I stacked proof. I did not argue about motives. I named actions. I did not smear my son. I forced him into daylight where his own words looked bad without my help. Then I set one more piece in motion, because reputations break when you open a window and show the mess. I forwarded the voicemail from the credit union's verification attempt to a dedicated folder named Thanksgiving Audit, shared to counsel and, through a separate link, to my own private archive, with time, caller ID, and the device metadata that captured the near-field clicks from Daniel's recorder app the last time he leaned too close to my chair. "That's paranoid," he hissed, and I said, "No, that's precise." And the VFW friend said, "It's smart." And Linda exhaled like an apology that hadn't yet found its words. Reputation isn't about winning a debate. It's about changing which story gets told on Monday. I wanted Monday to start with, "Thomas had his papers and his mind right," not "Thomas made a scene." So I kept my pace slow, my voice even, and my evidence undeniable. Then I let the pecan pie be cut while the boutique firm went silent, and Daniel's eyes kept flitting between the clock and the phone like a gambler trying to hide his tell. So I asked him a simple, lethal question that reputations cannot deflect. Why did the verification window start at 5 on Thanksgiving? And he said, "It's just when the banks staff up." And my neighbor laughed once, kindly and loud, and said, "They don't." And the room turned, just a little, but enough. Psychological operations are not magic. They are posture, timing, and restraint used like a pry bar. I went very still, which in a charged kitchen reads as either surrender or spring, and I let them choose wrong. I picked up the blue pen and rolled it between my fingers like an old habit. Then I set it down capped and said, "If you needed me competent last week to sign your drafts, then you don't get to call me confused tonight." And the sentence hung there and did the work no lecture can. I adjusted my chair and let a tiny stiffness show, because frailty is a coat I wear when I need to make a predator overconfident, and Daniel leaned in like a salesman who thinks the close is seconds away. Then I flipped the board with one soft instruction to counsel: read the funding receipts. And he did. 3 account names, 3 amounts, 3 posted times, all preceding tonight by days. And then, the line that kills the last excuse: Any further attempts to transfer are barred and will be investigated as coercion. Daniel reached for his phone like a man grabbing a rail and said, "We still need the authorization call." And I said, "We will not be making that call." Then I slid the manila draft back to him and asked, "Who put this in my coat?" And he said, "Too fast. Mom did." And Linda said, "He told me to." And then she stopped because the trap sprung and she heard it too. The phone buzzed with a spoofed label, Bank Fraud Department, which is clever and disgusting. And I said out loud for the room and the record, answering with counsel present. Then I tapped speaker, and a male voice launched into a script. "Mr. Hale, to prevent loss, we need you to confirm your trust agent." And I said, "Read the code phrase." And he faltered because he didn't have it. Then he tried to bulldoze, "We just need your yes." And I said, "No authorization. Not tonight, not ever." While counsel, God bless him, said, "You are on a recorded line. Identify your institution and your fraud case number." And the call died like a bad engine. Daniel pushed back from the table so hard his chair scraped a scar into the floor. Then he paced to the hall like a man checking weather he can't control. And I watched him without pity because pity is not a perimeter tool. The psychological pressure shifted. His favorite weapon, urgency, now worked against him, and he began to overshare. "Dad, I was trying to keep this from getting ugly." And I said, "Then why the coat, why the script, why the window during grace?" And he had no answer that didn't sound like a confession, so he didn't answer at all. I asked Nate to hand me the cedar box, and when I took it, I didn't open it. I simply placed it where Daniel could see it and understand his line of approach was closed, not by anger, but by locks older than his script. He looked at the front door, like it might offer him a cleaner exit, and the phone buzzed one more time with the boutique firm's number as the oven timer pinged cheerful nonsense, and I said, "We'll take one last call." Then I reached for the phone and glanced at the clock, which rolled over to 6:58, 2 minutes before their window closed, and I thought, good, now we find out if desperation makes them sloppy, because the next voice would tell me whether my son was going to stand down or light the fuse that drags us all into the public storm coming next. The call slid in at 6:58 like a blade under a door, and I put it on speaker with counsel live and the camera watching the kitchen light, because I wanted every syllable pinned down. A new voice carried a smooth grin and offered me a painless consolidation walkthrough, and I said authority first, then name the instrument, then date, because order beats charm every time. The voice tried to pivot into urgency, and Daniel timed a second phone in his palm like a drummer counting in a con, and I watched his thumb hover while I kept mine still. The line clicked, and a second caller badged as Fraud Department tried to warm me up with fear, so I asked for the code phrase, and he stalled, and counsel read the clause again with the patience of a man laying rebar, and the fake hung up hard enough to leave silence ringing. Daniel went for volume and said the house would be eaten by taxes if I didn't sign right now, and I pointed to the stamped page, to the instrument number, to the hold, and to the neighbor eating pecan pie like this was the best theater in town, and I let evidence do the talking because fear hates proof. Linda reached for the manila like it was a towel falling off a chair, and I slid it back and said, "No one touches the paper but me." And she stopped, and the room shifted a half-inch toward sober. The phone rang again, private number, same script. "Just a yes and we're done." And I said, "No authorization, not tonight, not ever." And the voice tried to bulldoze, and I asked for his badge and his case number, and he folded like wet drywall. I checked the oven, because turkey waits for no man, and I said, "We're going to let dessert cool while we keep our perimeter warm." And the VFW friend snorted at that, because bad men hate a joke that lands without malice. I kept the tempo steady, and you could feel Daniel's plan running out of air because the window was closing, and he had nothing but recycled lines and a blue pen that didn't belong to him. The counter-punch came, dirty, fast, and predictable, because predictable is a tell in any fight. Daniel stepped into the hall and made a call he thought I couldn't hear, but the house hears more than most sons remember. And he said, "Adult protective, too loud to be clever." I opened the front door before the knock, because knocking was coming, and I stood straight with counsel still on speaker and the affidavit in my left hand. And Linda whispered that this was unbelievable, and I said, "It is, and it's also ending." 2 officers arrived, polite and wary, and I treated them like guests and professionals, because respect turns down heat faster than any threat. And I handed them the sealed affidavit and the trust copy, and said, "I invited you to see the full picture." And I stepped back so the camera caught everybody at once. They read quickly and asked 3 clean questions, and I answered them in fewer words than they used. And one officer said, "You're squared away, sir." And the other nodded toward the dining room like he could smell staged urgency cooling on the plates. Daniel came back in wearing a smile that didn't fit, and I watched the moment he clocked the badges, and he tried to look wounded and helpful at the same time, and that facial math never balances. The boutique number called back as if to complete the chorus, and I answered and said, "Development, law enforcement on site, counsel present, all instruments funded, proceed only with file numbers," and the line went quiet, like a man chewing on a bad idea, and then it disconnected. I felt the house exhale, and I tasted dry turkey in advance because I had just spent all the moisture on the truth. He ratcheted again because some people only have one tool, and it is pressure. He tried to reach around my perimeter by reaching for Linda, and he sold her fear with a soft voice and a furrowed brow, and he said we could lose everything if Dad keeps digging in, and she said the word duty like it could wrap a grab as a hug, and I said duty without respect is just leverage in church clothes, and I took the envelope back and put it under my palm and didn't move. He tried to lift the scene into drama so the facts would drown, and he raised his voice and called me stubborn, and I lowered mine and called myself documented. And the officer stayed for 1 more minute, just long enough to change the scent of the room from theater to report. He flung one more trick, a spoofed text with a link dressed up as my bank, and I read the domain out loud like a teacher saying, "Nice try." And I air-gapped my phone with a flick, because my hands still remember field protocols. And I watched him watch that move and finally understand that his day had met a wall he did not know how to climb. I leaned into muscle memory not for force, but for flow. I ran a 5-paragraph order in my head like a quiet prayer. Situation: attempted coordinated transfer scheme masked as care. Mission: preserve command of assets, protect spouse from courier duty, and keep tonight lawful and calm. Execution: holds verified, counsel live, cameras recording, witnesses present, and strict comms discipline. Admin and logistics: documents secured, trust receipts ready, oven timer set, and water glasses full. Command and signal: my house, my perimeter, my word final. Counsel is primary comms, neighbor is witness, bank manager on standby as reserve. I set sectors inside the home the way I set them on a muddy site, and I put Daniel's phones into a figurative box by keeping my own phone on the table in the center where the microphone loved my voice the most, and I kept his hands busy with small questions I didn't need answered just to break his rhythm. OODA loop. Observe his tells, orient to his timing, decide at my pace, act with precision, and then loop again before he can regroup. He tried to push the clock, and I owned it instead, and at 7:04 I said, "Sit rep complete." And I reminded myself of the standing ROE. Do not raise your voice, do not chase, and do not let pity write checks. I ran pace in the background too. Primary is counsel call, alternate is recorded phone line. Contingency is neighbor's testimony. Emergency is body cam style timestamp video pointed at the table. And each layer held, because planning is just love you give your future self. So when the porch light flickered once, and then again because the grid hates November gusts, I already had the generator ready to hum, and I had a flashlight standing by like a candle in uniform. And I almost smiled because Power had no idea how much losing a room light helps a man like me. He looked for darkness to hide in and found none, because my systems run even when the wall switches take a breath. The officers stepped back onto the porch to write notes in a warm car, and I sent Nate to hand them a copy of the affidavit with a thank you, and I saw the officer take it with a nod that says this family has a grown-up at the table. Daniel tried to sprint to the garage door for some fresh air and a private call, and he pulled it and found it keyed, and I let the quiet lock say that my perimeter knows his routes better than he knows his own. He laughed without humor and said I was making this a battlefield, and I said no, I am turning this house back into a home, and homes have rules that protect. He said I learned control in the army, and I said I learned control building houses that stand in wind, and wind is tonight, and we are still standing. The convergence hit at once like weather stacking on a ridge, and I walked it instead of letting it carry me. The bank manager called me back and said the IP logs lit like a Christmas string from a device registered to Daniel's business account, and he asked if I would like a written incident report by Monday, and I said, yes, please send to counsel. And I watched Daniel's eyes jump to the clock again like time could reverse if he stared hard enough. The VA benefits officer texted a one-liner, third-party ping again, logged and blocked, respect. And that word landed warm as a hand on a shoulder. The boutique firm partner finally stepped in and left a carefully worded voicemail that smelled like liability and lavender. And he called my counsel, sir, twice, which made me think he'd studied apology the way a man studies a map while his car is already in a ditch. The extended family group chat pinged from 3 phones at once because my memo had hit their screens. And my sister-in-law wrote, glad he's protected. And my cousin wrote, we've seen this play. And I didn't reply because victory does not brag if it wants to last. The VFW friend texted a short note to the hall captain that said, Tom is good. And I saw the ripple hit men who know me from sandbag lines and pancake breakfasts. And reputation turned like a slow ship and pointed its bow toward my dock. Then the door gave a second knock that had paper in it, and I opened to a process server with a polite face and a folder he didn't write, and he said, temporary guardianship petition, hearing requested. And I said, thank you, and signed the acknowledgement with my own pen because small rituals keep a man steady. I handed it to counsel through the phone with a scanned copy, and a minute later he texted back, filed 5 hours ago. We will respond. Their basis is boilerplate. And I breathed once and said, this is the last hill, and then the weather clears. The officers returned for a closing word, and I told them we had legal counsel on the petition, and they said, we are done here, and I said, so are we. The security camera above the porch caught Daniel on the sidewalk calling someone and hissing that I was ruining everything, and the camera mic picked up the name of the outside advisor, and I saved the clip to the Thanksgiving audit folder because Monday loves a clean exhibit. The phone tried one last scare, a text about urgent portal review, and I held it up so everyone could see the exact grammar error that floats through 90% of scams, and even Linda let out a small, unwilling laugh. And that laugh was the first thaw in an evening packed with hard edges. The last front arrived where these storms always land, right at the kitchen table, with dessert hovering and feelings trying to break into orders. And I met it like a man clearing a clogged drain, steady and unglamorous. I turned to Linda and said, I am not your opponent, and I am not your courier. And I told her, I love you, and I will not make you choose between quiet and safe ever again. And I asked her to put the envelope down like it was a hot pan and not a wedding vow, and she did, slow and shaky. And she said she didn't want a war, and I said me neither. And that's why we fortify before thieves test the gate. She asked me if I was disowning our son, and I said, I am disowning his schemes. And there is a road back for him if he wants it. But it starts with confession and cash flow in the right direction. And no more outside advisors hiding behind words like painless. I turned to Daniel and said, here are the terms. And I counted them on my hand because hands make rules feel real. Stop the calls, stop the courier games, repay what you can on a schedule you will keep in ink. Meet my counsel with your own and sign a statement that you will never attempt authorization on my behalf. And apologize to your mother and to Nate for using our table like a stage. He called it ridiculous, and I called it repair, and I reminded him that people who sell control as care usually end up alone, and I told him I would grieve that future if he chose it. But I would not pay for it with my name. He said he was trying to protect me, and I said protect means you lock the door from thieves, not lock the owner out. The room went very still, and you could hear the refrigerator click like it was embarrassed by us. And I put the cedar box on the table and tapped the lid once, and told Nate that someday this box will be his if he keeps telling the truth when his voice trembles. And he nodded without looking away, and I wrote that moment into my bones. I said to Daniel that love is not logistics, and family is not an excuse, and he stared at his hands like they could write a better ending. And I let him stare because looking down is where most turnarounds begin. I told Linda I would speak to her tomorrow after she slept and the noise drained out, and I asked my neighbor to walk out with Daniel so the porch light would have 2 good men under it instead of one man trying to sell his father's voice to a stranger. He went, and Linda wiped the ring of coffee off the table in one slow circle, and we stood in a home that felt like itself again, scratched floor and all. Then my phone buzzed with the bank manager's number, and I answered, and he said a last-minute wire attempt just hit from a device tagged to Daniel's company, and it failed, and he asked if I could come in at 8 a.m. to sign the incident affidavit and lock a new setting, and I said yes, of course, and he said bring counsel, and I said counsel will be there. The porch camera lit once more with headlights stopping at my curb, and another knock carried through the door, lighter than the servers and later than common courtesy, and I stepped toward it because some storms like to throw one more gust after the roof is bolted, and I told myself, this next paper decides how we teach tomorrow. So I opened the door and waited to see which name was printed on the envelope. The envelope had my bank's logo up top and a quiet weight, and inside sat an incident affidavit and a short letter from the manager, signed at 7:11 p.m. I read, attempted wire from device tagged to Daniel Hale Enterprises blocked at 1859. Logs preserved. Please sign to open formal investigation. And I stood there a second longer than I needed, because this was the first time the story wasn't mine alone. I took a photo of the envelope. I scanned the pages to the Thanksgiving audit folder, and I signed where the X waited. Then I slipped on my boots and walked the papers back out to the server who had waited in his car like a pro, and he took them with a nod and said, "We'll make sure this gets where it needs to go." And I said, "Me too," and locked the door behind me. Linda leaned in the kitchen doorway and asked, "Is this really happening?" And I said, "It already happened. Now we document." And I started dishes, because movement keeps panic from staging a comeback. At 8:03, the boutique firm sent an email with the subject line, "Stand down," and inside was a sentence they probably copy and paste when heat turns on. "We will not engage further with any party regarding your estate and will direct all inquiries to your counsel." And a second sentence that tasted like fear. "We did not advise any third-party contact with your institutions." And I forwarded it to counsel and to the folder and wrote, "Paper trail achieved." At 8:19, the VA officer pinged me again. "APS check closed. Our notes show competent. Appreciate heads up." And that line sat like a warm coat over my shoulders, because truth likes to arrive in uniform when lies get loud. I walked to the shop, placed the cedar box inside the safe, and then added the coat pocket draft next to it, not as a keepsake, but as evidence of a ridiculous reach that fizzled under light. Linda sat at the table and picked at the ring of coffee she'd wiped thin but not gone, and she said, "I didn't see it until it was too late." And I said, "Then see it now." And I put the manila envelope in a clear plastic sleeve and labeled it with painter's tape. Draft, not signed, 11/27. I slept short and woke on the first alarm, drove to the bank at 7:50, and the manager met me at the door with a clipboard and an apology I didn't need, and I said, "No sorry necessary, just the logs." And he printed the IPs, the timestamp, and the device fingerprint, and we both initialed the bottom. At 8:34, my counsel slid a file across his conference table and said, "Guardianship petition set ex parte for Monday a.m. Our reply goes in by noon today. Your affidavit locks it." And I nodded, signed, and watched the scanner swallow the pages into a folder named Case 241139, because systems beat chaos in every season. At 9:12, my neighbor from the VFW texted a photo of Daniel arguing on the sidewalk with the outside advisor, and the caption said, "Caught audio. Without his voice, we can't do anything." And I saved it, because breakdown is not drama. It is a house of cards meeting a door with real hinges. By 10, consequences came in a row like nails in a strip. The notary emailed, "I did not notarize any Hale documents. If my name is on something, it is forged." My counsel replied, "Please preserve all logs." And I added her to a list that was starting to look like a ledger of people who wanted distance from a plan they once smiled at. At noon, a client of Daniel's left a polite message on my phone. "I'm stepping back from work with your son until he resolves family issues. Wishing you peace." And I didn't return it because a father doesn't stand between a son and the wind he called down. By afternoon, Linda went quiet. And in that quiet, I saw the shape of a resolve I hadn't seen in her for a long time. And she said, "He used me." And I said, "He counted on you." And she pressed her lips together like a woman setting a nail straight before she swings. The breakdown felt nothing like triumph. It felt like a beam finally shifting back to level, slow and with a groan that tells you the stress was real. At dusk, the sheriff's office emailed a file number for my report and a single line, "Further attempts will route to detective." And then the porch light came on with the first true calm of the week, and I wrote the day's ledger on my pad. Bank logs, petition answered, firm retreat, notary denial, VA closed file, neighbor witness, and under it I wrote, "Perimeter holds." The house went to sleep like a machine finally powered down, and I sat in the dark kitchen and traced the grain in the table with one finger, and let the relief be quiet. Because loud relief draws trouble, like porch lights draw moths. He called at 7:06 a.m. on Saturday and left a voicemail full of air.
"Dad, can we talk? It got out of hand. I was just trying to protect you. I need 5 minutes, please."
And I listened once, then again. Then I called counsel and said,
"It'll come."
And counsel said,
"We'll keep it in the driveway."
and I agreed, because boundaries need asphalt under them, not carpets. At 9, he parked at the curb and didn't kill the engine for a full minute, and then he stepped out, alone, with his hands open, like a man on a stage he didn't audition for. And he said,
"I messed up."
And I said,
"Say it like a record, not a performance."
And he swallowed and said,
"I tried to take control."
And I nodded once, because naming poison is the first antidote. He leaned against his car like he wanted it to hold him up and said, "I thought if I could get the trust reopened, I could stop the taxes from eating you alive." And I said, "You thought if you controlled the accounts, your stress would shrink." And he stared at the hood and didn't argue, because the hood didn't ask him for a script. He went small in the shoulders and bigger in the excuses. Business got tight, and then the advisor said we could do this clean if we timed it, and I thought you taught me duty, and I thought you'd thank me later. And I said, "Duty is a shared load, not a crowbar." And he looked at the sky like it had an easier father lined up for him. He tried the back door again. "We can still fix this quietly. You can revoke the affidavit, and we can do a clean slate." And I put up a hand and ended that dream before it learned to walk. "No." And he flinched, like he'd forgotten how short a word can be, and how much work it can do. He tried to slide money into the center as the cure. "I can repay some now if we just move the accounts to a consolidated platform. It's ridiculous to have everything fragmented." And I said, "Fragmented is safe when you are the one sweeping the table." And he looked down at the driveway pebbles and ground one under his shoe like he could crush a habit with his heel. He reached for guilt because guilt had worked when he was 12. "If you loved me, you'd make this simple." And my answer came out low and even. "I love you enough to make this strong." He said, "Mom's on my side." And I said, "Your mother is on the side of honesty." And he exhaled like a man seeing a map he doesn't like. I laid out terms because men need targets, even when they hate the range. "You will send a written statement before noon that you attempted to authorize transfers on my behalf. You will email every institution retracting any request. You will meet my counsel Monday to sign a non-authorization agreement. You will set up repayment on a schedule you can keep without me bailing you out, and you will write your mother and Nate an apology without the word 'but' in it." He said, "You're strangling me." And I said, I am cutting off a scheme. You can breathe fine when you stand on your own. He went for tears because tears had bought him time before. I'm drowning. And I said, then stop drilling holes in your boat. He asked, can I have $5,000 to make payroll Monday? And I said, you can have a list of jobs paying $30 an hour, and I will call a foreman I trust if you show up sober and humble. And he said, that's humiliating. And I said, that's honest. He asked for the blue pen, out of habit as much as hope, and I kept my hands in my pockets, because old rituals need to die in the cold, and I let the silence teach him that no signature was coming to save him. He said, I don't know how to fix this. And I said, start with the letter. And he nodded like a man bending at the waist for the first time in years. I brought him into the garage with the door open and the cold air awake, and I stood by my workbench and put both hands on the edge, like I do when a new apprentice needs to hear something that might sting and help at the same time. And I said, listen like you're on a roof, and one bad step is a fall. He nodded. You sold control as care, I said, and you hid it under words I taught you, duty, efficiency, family. And that's an old trick with new stationery, and it doesn't work here. He stared at the vice like it might offer him an easier sentence. You aimed for my absences, I said, and you stacked your attempt against my VA dates and our holiday and your mother's habit of helping, and that's not protection, that's a grab. He shook his head once, tiny, because tiny is what denial looks like when it knows it lost. You used urgency because urgency shuts down thinking, I said, and you hoped my love would bend the perimeter, and you treated my home like logistics, and you forgot that love takes care of the human first, the paper after. He rubbed his thumbnail with his teeth like a 12-year-old caught stealing lunch money, and I let the picture sit there a moment, because time is part of teaching too. You brought an outside advisor, I said, so you could borrow his words and his confidence, and he ran when the wind shifted, which is what hired confidence does when it costs more than it pays. He said everyone does this. And I said, everyone who gets caught says everyone does this. I held up a printed page, the affidavit that said, I am competent, I am present, I am not confused, and I tapped it with a knuckle. This is how you respect a man who built your rooms. You bring him receipts, not scripts. He laughed once, short and bitter, and I didn't chase it. If you want back into this house as a son with a key, I said, you will learn a new set of tools. You will work a ledger where numbers aren't suggestions. You will show up to a foreman and take a job you don't like because doing what you don't like long enough to fix what you broke is called being a man. You will make amends in order, first to those you lied to, then to those you used. He asked, what about the holidays? And I said, we eat when we're honest. He asked, what about the will? And I said, this isn't a will conversation. This is a character conversation. The paper follows the person. He said, you're cold. And I said, I'm clear. He said, I don't want to lose you. And I said, stop acting like you already have. I pointed to the coat pocket draft sealed in plastic on a shelf, and I said, that plastic is what kept you from drowning in a charge sheet. That plastic is what kept your mother from crying in a witness chair. That plastic is what kept Nate from choosing a side he shouldn't have to choose. Learn to thank the plastic. He stood there long enough to make me think he might bolt, and then he said, I'll write the letter. And I said, write it by noon. He asked, can I hug you? And I said, hug me when the letter hits my inbox. He walked out past the open garage door with his head down, and I let him go without a blessing because blessings come after work, not before. Justice arrived without fireworks, which is the only way I trusted. Monday morning, the guardianship petition hit the judge's desk and slid right back with denied, stamped neat and permanent, and a note, affidavit, witness statements, institutional logs, petition lacks merit. And my counsel forwarded it with one line, case closed unless appealed, and I replied, noted, and moved the email to the audit folder. The bank mailed me a formal letter that said, fraud attempt recorded, device is banned, any future contact about your accounts must go through counsel, trusted contact on file, counsel, not family. and I pinned that to my paperboard with a brass tack so I could see it when I pour coffee. The boutique firm mailed a 2-paragraph apology that felt drafted by an insurance carrier, and they included a sentence that mattered anyway. "We have terminated our relationship with the outside advisor referenced," and I set it next to the notary's note that she had self-reported a potential misuse of her name to the state board. And 3 weeks later, a letter arrived that the state had suspended her commission pending review. And I did not celebrate. I underlined the date and filed it. Daniel emailed at 11:53 a.m., 7 minutes early, a plain confession of his attempt to authorize transfers on my behalf without my consent, a retraction addressed to each institution, and a promise to cease. And he added a line to Linda and Nate that finally got the word "but" out of his mouth. "I'm sorry for putting you in this." And I printed it and put it in a new folder labeled Repair Attempts. I executed the disinheritance enforcement clause that says any coercion play triggers a freeze on discretionary bequests, and I signed it with my own blue pen, hand steady, and my counsel countersigned, and we mailed copies to the file so the lesson would have teeth if memory got foggy. I did not file charges because I decided the record and the boundaries had done enough to teach, but I left the door open with the sheriff file number if necessity returned. I wrote a 3-sentence letter to the outside advisor. "Cease contact with me and my institutions. All communication must go through counsel. Any future attempt will be treated as harassment." And we sent it certified so the green card would come back with a signature that proves he got the message. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the cedar box in front of me and called Nate over and handed him a small envelope with a single brass key and said, "Spare for the safe. You don't use it unless I say, but you hold it because you held the line." And he nodded like a boy who just learned a job he intends to keep. The house felt level, the ledger balanced. The blue pen sat where it belongs, capped on my desk, waiting to sign the kind of papers that build, not the kind that bleed. At 8:02 p.m., my phone lit with a text from Daniel. "I'm at the door. I have the repayment plan. I brought my own pen." And I looked at Linda and said, "Ready." And she nodded once like a woman who has learned to keep a door and her peace at the same time, and I stood up because the next knock would decide how we live in this house going forward. Not as a battlefield, but as a place where truth and mercy share a table without letting the lock rust. I weekended the door and found my son standing with a folder in both hands like a man who finally understood that paper is heavier when it tells the truth. And he said he had a plan that did not touch my name, and I told him to come in but to leave old habits on the porch, and he stepped over the threshold with smaller steps than he used to take, because smaller is safer when you are learning balance. We sat at the table that holds stains from coffee and a scratch from a chair that ran hot, and he spread out a payment schedule written in his own hand with numbers that matched his bank stubs, not his fantasies, and he said, "Every Friday, automatic, no surprises." And I said, "Keep it boring." And he nodded because boring is the new miracle in a house that just put out a ridiculous fire. Linda listened and did not interrupt, which was new, and she asked one question about the first transfer and then smiled without making a show of it. And I marked that moment like a pencil tick on a doorframe because growth likes to be measured. I called counsel on speaker and read the schedule, and we filed it with a trust so accountability has somewhere to sleep at night. And Daniel signed a simple pledge that he would not attempt authorization in my name, and that any slip would break our deal. And he used his own pen and put it back in his pocket, and that mattered more than he knew. The next morning, I drove to the lumberyard with Nate, and we bought cedar for a bench we had talked about. And he carried boards without dragging them, and asked questions like, "Why does cedar last in the rain?" And I answered with both hands while we cut mortises and set pegs. And that bench came together square, because our plan was square. And I put it under the maple for spring, because you plant the future where you will sit and breathe. I returned to the VFW hall the next week and took back my Wednesday shift, fixing whatever broke. And I showed a younger man how to replace a ballast without cursing the fixture, and he laughed anyway, and the room felt like a place where weight gets shared. I joined a Thursday morning coffee group of men who survived deployments and divorces and debt and did not make drama out of any of it. And I told them in short sentences what happened at my table. And one of them said, "You wrote a clean report." And I said, "I wrote a clean life." And the room went quiet in the good way. I cut back on the number of keys on my ring because some doors don't need to open anymore, and I added a small safe for documents that used to float in drawers like ghosts, and I updated the list in my cedar box the first Saturday of every month, and that rhythm put sleep back where it belongs. I kept my health appointments, I walked the block before dinner, and I installed a motion light by the side gate because light is cheaper than stress. And I put a note on the fridge that says, Article 9, read before dessert, and we laugh at it now, which is how you know the ground is solid again. The outside advisor tried one last email 3 weeks later with a new subject line and the same old hunger, and it bounced off counsel like a bird hitting a clean window. And then a letter arrived from his firm that he had been separated, and I filed it without gloating because gloating warps the wood of your own house. The notary's commission went on ice pending review, and a short notice posted on the county site listed 3 irregularities in her book that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with a bad habit of stamping first and thinking later. And I printed it and put it behind the apology letter from the boutique partner who wrote like a man whose premiums just went up. Daniel's company shrank to half its size by Christmas, and he sold the truck that was more swagger than tool, and he took a foreman job on a commercial build where he wears a hard hat with someone else's logo. And the first time I drove past and saw him flag a delivery truck into position with both arms steady and no phone in his hand, I let myself nod once and keep driving because approval is not candy you toss out of a parade float. He missed 1 repayment in February and texted before the due date, "Short this week, we'll pay double next Friday, no excuses." And I replied with 2 words, "Keep schedule." And he did, and the double payment hit, and we didn't have to talk about it, because the ledger said enough. Linda sent the boutique firm a short note that said, "Stop mailing our home," and they did. And she blocked 3 numbers without asking me first because she had learned that acting is stronger than worrying. And I watched her schedule her own appointment with the bank to confirm her accounts were labeled the way she wanted them. And she came home with a printout and a smile, and that smile belongs in a frame. The sheriff's detective closed our file with a friendly call and said, "We see this mess more lately. Most folks don't have their documents ready." And I said, "They will after we talk at the senior center." And he said, "I'll bring the projector." And we set a date for March. Consequences landed without drama, like rain that waters more than it washes away. And our block noticed that our porch light went back to a normal glow instead of a beacon for nonsense. And that was a relief you can measure in steady heartbeats. I framed the rejection stamp from the guardianship petition and put it in the shop over the vice, not for spite, but as a reminder that paperwork can be a fence against crazy when it is built before the storm. We met Daniel every Saturday for breakfast at a diner that smells like coffee and batter and second chances, and the rule is simple, 27 minutes, which is how long it takes a short stack to arrive. And he brings 1 page, which is how many lies can hide in a good week. And we keep our voices low and our statements plain. And he says, deposit made, job solid, cravings managed, no new advisors. And I say, stay boring. And Linda asks 1 question about his cash flow so he remembers that love pays attention, not just bills. The first time he tried to pull the conversation toward inheritance and forgiveness, in a single breath I took a sip of coffee and said, character first. And he said, I know. And he stopped talking and started chewing like a man who understands that silence can be work, too. Nate joins once a month and he brings a drawing of the next project he wants on the bench, and Daniel studies the lines and asks how he can help. And we give him 1 task, sand the edges. Because edges cut and sanding teaches patience, and he sands without pushing for the saw, which is progress measured in dust. Holidays returned with simple rules we write on index cards and tape to the fridge so no one has to guess. No manila envelopes at dinners, no unknown numbers answered at the table, no speeches, only grace, and the best story told is the one with the fewest adjectives. We had Christmas with a trimmed guest list and a larger pot of coffee and a small plate set aside for a neighbor who lost his wife and preferred company to casseroles. And Daniel showed up with a pie he actually baked, and it was ugly and good. And we ate it, without turning it into a symbol. Because dessert is better when it is just dessert. I keep the disinheritance enforcement clause in place like a lock that doesn't squeak, and I tell Daniel the conditions whenever he's tempted to test the hinges. Honesty over time, repayment on schedule, no outside handlers, steady work, clean holidays. And he says, copy. And when he says copy, it isn't a salute. It's a promise he makes to himself, out loud. He asked in April if he could take Nate fishing with me, and I said, yes, with me. And we went to a small lake with bad cell service and better quiet. And the boy caught nothing and had a better day than most of his peers will ever understand. And Daniel baited hooks and asked me about the best way to float a line in wind, and I showed him and didn't say the metaphor because sometimes the lesson insults the student when you underline it, and the line sailed right anyway. We kept therapy off camera and in motion. I had coffee with an old platoon mate who now runs a peer group, and Daniel sat with a counselor twice a month and brought receipts to breakfast without saying what was said in the room, because privacy is not secrecy when you are doing the work, and that distinction is an adult skill. Long after the dust settled, I kept returning to the same quiet, ridiculous truth that saved me, which is that preparation looks boring until it saves your life. And I started speaking it out loud in places that would listen. Senior centers, church basements, build sites during lunch, VFW halls. And I told the story as a first-person report with receipts and not a victim's speech with violins. And I held up the affidavit, the trust stamp, the call log, and the code phrase like a carpenter holds up a square to show the cut is true. And men and women nodded, because square is a language everyone understands. I told them to make a trust and fund it before the holiday season, and to choose a counsel who picks up at 6:15, and to plant a witness in their dinners who understands that love without proof is a dangerous hobby, and to train a phrase like steel blue into their banks so a spoof can't talk its way into a vault, and to polish their metals when anger rises because polishing is a prayer with a rag, and it stops you from swinging at ghosts. I told them that painless is a dangerous word in a kitchen, and that consolidation is the polite spelling of control when a son wants to be a king, and that the line, "I'm protecting you," without receipts, is just pressure in a nice suit. And I told them to practice the sentence, "No authorization, not tonight, not ever," because practiced sentences are hammers you can reach in the dark. I told them that gratitude is proven in protection, not gifts, and that Thanksgiving is a mission set, not a stage, and that nothing tastes as good as a house that is safe. I told them that love is not a shortcut and that silence can be power if it stands on evidence, and I told them that mercy must live inside a fence or it gets eaten alive by performers. People always ask about forgiveness, and I say it is a budget line, not a blank check. And I set numbers to it, time, behavior, cash flow, and no more scripts. And I tell them that letting a son grow up under the weight he earned is not cruelty, it is carpentry, because weight shapes wood and men the same way, when you apply it with discipline. On Memorial Day, I took Nate to the cemetery, and we set small flags and read names we did not know. And I told him these men taught me to plan my life with checklists, not speeches. And he said, "I like checklists." And I said, "Me too." And we went for burgers and said nothing heavy because grief does not need to be milked to be real. On the first anniversary of the night my table almost turned into a farce, we sat with pie and coffee and no phones, and Linda told the story as a joke and not a wound, and Daniel passed the whipped cream and didn't correct the details, which means he has learned the best part of accountability, that you let the unflattering facts stand because they built the man you are trying to be. The moral I write on the inside cover of my ledger now is simple and mean and correct. Quiet preparation defeats performative authority. And under it I carved with a pocket knife the line Nate likes to repeat when we lock the shop. Duty endures, but self-care liberates. And when I close the book, the words split and then meet again at the seam like they were designed to be folded and carried, which they are. I used to think legacy was a will and a cedar box, and it is. But it is also the walk you take at dusk without looking over your shoulder, and the bench that doesn't wobble under the weight of 3 people who finally learn to sit without taking each other's air. And it is the phone on the counter, face down, quiet, harmless, because the only voice it needs belongs to the man pouring coffee. When I kill the lights at night, I run the same line through my head like a checklist and a prayer. Silence with proof outlives every raised voice, and the house answers back in its own way, with the soft click of locks that hold and the clean hum of a fridge that just keeps working. And that is the sound of peace you earn.